I would like to introduce your keynote speaker today. Stephen Olson is a research fellow here at the Hinrich Foundation. He also has a 30-year career internationally, starting in Washington, D.C. as an international trade negotiator on NAFTA, back in the NAFTA days, and then becoming president of the Pacific Basin Economic Council. He's also a visiting scholar at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And I think of him as Mr. AMA, if you're familiar with Ask Me Anything on Reddit. He just knows, he has such a broad knowledge base in this area. And so I would encourage you to, ask him anything in this area. And so actually that is what he's going to be doing for us here today. He is going to be laying the groundwork for the rest of the week with World Tour of the Trade Horizon. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Steve.
Thanks, Anne. All right, well, hello, good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to each and every one of you. It's real nice to see a couple of old familiar faces and to also have the opportunity to make a lot of new friends. So thank you very much for coming. I always look forward to sessions like this with journalists for a variety of reasons, but not the least of which is I think you guys have an incredibly important job. I think a free, inquisitive, capable press is an essential element of any functioning society. And I think the U.S. founding fathers showed a good deal of wisdom and foresight in recognizing the importance of a free media and enshrining protections in the Constitution. So you guys have a really important job. Thank you very much. And I also should say I come from a family of newspaper readers. So as soon as I was able to read, I started every morning with a bowl of cereal and the New York Daily News to see how the New York Yankees have done. It's 50 years later, it's still the same drill, except I read the Daily News and the New York Times on my iPad. Okay, guys, well, look, let's jump in. As Anne said, what I'd like to do is to provide you with a little sort of set the groundwork for your program here in Singapore by providing you a very abbreviated tour of the global trade horizon. And there are three issues in particular. All right, perfect. So could you do me a favor and advance the slides for me? Thanks very much. So look, here are the three issues I'd like us to run through. Issue number one, after the recent visit of Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, Treasury Secretary Yellen, and more recently than that, Climate Envoy John Kerry, where are we with the U.S.-China relationship? Number two, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Biden administration's signature trade initiative for the region, which is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement. And then finally, I want to be sure to draw your attention to a fairly profound shift that is underway in recent years and is only going to intensify in future years, and that is trade is no longer just about trade. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so let's dive in with our first topic, the U.S.-China relationship. Where are we today? So look, in the aftermath of the so-called spy balloon incident, I think it's safe to say that the U.S.-China relationship has been in somewhat of a deep freeze. But now, after we've had these recent high-profile visits, the conventional wisdom seems to be suggesting that we could be seeing a bit of a thawing in the relationship, a bit of a warming up in the relationship between the U.S. and China. In my judgment, that analysis is incorrect. And I would urge you not to read too much into this simple resumption of bilateral dialogues. Nothing that has happened in the meetings which have already transpired, and nothing that will happen in the meetings that we can safely expect to see between senior officials in the weeks and months to come, will fundamentally alter the antagonistic dynamic that exists between these two countries and the adversarial perceptions that each country holds of the other. So consider for a minute what those perceptions are. Let's start with China. Now, correctly or incorrectly, China believes, pure and simple, the United States is determined to block China's rise. Period, full stop, end of sentence. And they base this judgment on the restrictions that we've seen put in place under the Trump administration, carried through into the Biden administration, and then more importantly, the chokehold on some of the cutting edge technologies that the US has placed on China. And President Xi Jinping has been very blunt and in public speeches has talked about his belief that the United States and the West are actively encircling and actively attempting to suppress China's rise. Okay, so what about the US? What about the other side of the coin? What are the US perceptions? Well, again, correctly or incorrectly, US policymakers have concluded that China is determined to usurp the post-war global trade system and rules-based system, period. A system that the United States largely designed and has been led for the last 3/4 of a century. And they base this judgment on a number of things. They look at China's increasing military aggressiveness in the region. They look at China's determination to acquire cutting-edge technologies that really have game-changing military applications. And perhaps in particular, they look very closely at China's response to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Now, from the perspective of the West, from the perspective of the United States and the European Union, Russia's invasion is a threat not only to the underpinnings, the fundamental underpinnings of the European Union, but this entire stable post-war global system. And so in the view of the United States, European Union, the West, the only appropriate response to this existential threat is harsh condemnation of Russia, very tough sanctions put in place, and material support for Ukraine. Now, not only has China not done those things, but it's dramatically increased its imports from Russia, particularly in the energy section, thereby directly or indirectly fueling Russia's war effort. Xi Jinping talks constantly about his friendship without limits with Vladimir Putin. Their bromance is out there in front for everyone to see. And Xi Jinping routinely expresses his point of view that the West is in decline and the East is rising. And that we are now seeing changes in the world that we have not seen in 100 years. And I don't know if you guys caught this or not, but literally the last words that Xi Jinping spoke to Vladimir Putin when he was leaving Moscow after his recent visit, Putin had walked him literally to his car. And the last words Xi Jinping spoke to Vladimir Putin were those words: the world is seeing changes not seen in 100 years, and we, Russia and China, are driving those changes. Okay, so these are the perceptions, again, correctly or incorrectly, that each country holds of the other. Now look, I want to be clear, talking is always better than not talking. I'm happy to see it. We should welcome it. We should regard it as a positive development. But, and this is a very big but, short of dramatic and highly unlikely policy changes on the part of one country or the other, these entrenched antagonistic perceptions are going to remain unless the United States removes most, if not all, of these restrictions, and in particular the technology restrictions that has been put in place in China. China will continue to maintain its belief that the US is simply determined to block China's rise. And look, Janet Yellen can stand up anytime she wants, and Anthony Blinken can stand up anytime he wants and say, we don't want to block China's rise, but they look at the policies, and by and large, they don't believe them. China would have to reorient its entire geopolitical outlook, both regionally and globally, for the US to change its perceptions. So at least for the near term, it seems that these antagonistic perceptions are going to remain. Now, what does that suggest about where we're headed? Well, my crystal ball doesn't work any better than any of yours, but let me sketch out a couple of scenarios that I think for the short term are most realistic. First of all, I think you can bet on most, if not all, of the US restrictions that have been put in place on China remaining in place. The United States is undergoing a review of the tariffs. I wouldn't expect to see anything dramatic there. And I think, in fact, it's probably likely that we're going to see restrictions expand. And there's two things in particular to expect. The White House has supposedly been working on an executive order that it always seems ready to announce, but never gets around to announcing, which would establish an outbound review of investments, which doesn't specifically target China by name, but as a practical matter, everyone understands would primarily be targeted towards China. And the other thing I think you can expect to see, which is a bit arcane, but potentially significant, I think the Commerce Department will shortly be tightening up some of their semiconductor restrictions, in particular trying to catch those semiconductors that are central for artificial intelligence. So US restrictions aren't going anywhere and probably will be ratcheted up. Now, of course, this will only deepen China's perception that the United States is determined to block China's rise. On the other side of the coin, I expect to see China becoming more willing to respond in kind. I expect to see China being more willing to exploit the significant areas of vulnerability that the United States has in its trading relationships with China. If you didn't get a chance to see the remarks, take a look at them when you have a chance. But the China's ambassador to the United States spoke recently at the Aspen conference. And he just said point blank, China will not sit idly by. We will not sit idly by in the face of all of these restrictions being put in place. Okay, so I think the recent export restrictions that were placed on two metals, I'm sorry, I can never pronounce the name. One sounds sort of like geranium, but isn't, and the other is gallium. I always screw up the names, I'm sorry. But the two metals that were export restrictions were recently imposed on, I think could be a sign of things to come. I think the restrictions placed on Micron Technologies, I think could also be a bit of a shot across the bow. So I think at least for the near term, this is unfortunately where we are in the US-China relationship. All right, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so let's shift gears and let's take a look at something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. This is the Biden administration's signature trade initiative for the region. It consists of the US and 13 partners: Australia, Brunei, Fiji, India, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, New Zealand, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. Now, I want you to know that I typically would memorize and commit to memory the names of all these countries and different trade agreements, but two things happened. Number one, there's been a big proliferation in these trade agreements, so it's more countries to keep track of. But the second thing is I got old, and when you get old, it's harder to remember stuff, so I apologize for having to read that off. The negotiations are still underway on the IPEF agreement, and the unofficial informal deadline that it's understood the negotiators are working towards will be when the United States hosts the APEC leaders meeting in November in San Francisco. Now, I see two plausible and diametrically opposite potential scenarios for where these IPEF negotiations are going to go. The optimistic scenario is that IPEF produces an innovative new template for how we are going to do trade agreements in a post-FTA, a post-free trade agreement type of world that we now appear to be in. At the other end of the spectrum, I think it's possible that IPEF is a near total non-event. A near total non-event. Now, at this point, with negotiations underway, I think there's roughly a 50% chance of either outcome, but I have to tell you, I feel myself gradually starting to lean towards non-event. We will see, but I'm starting to, I still think roughly 50-50 outcome for each, but I'm leaning more towards non-event. Now, as you continue to watch these negotiations unfold, I would suggest there's three things that you keep an eye on. The first, and perhaps most importantly, is that the IPEF is not, triple underline, not a traditional free trade agreement. Okay, that's why I said in the best case scenario, this could be a new template for how we do free trade agreements in a post-free trade agreement world. Now, the most important respect in which it is not a traditional free trade agreement is that there won't be traditional market access commitments. So their tariff reductions, for example, are not on the agenda. The United States will not be making any market opening commitments in these negotiations. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons, not the least of which is that traditionally and historically, the United States has used market access to the United States as leverage. That's what it is used to coax its negotiating partners into agreeing to the higher standard agreements that some of them are reluctant to. They've used market access to the United States as leverage. That leverage now does not exist in the IPEF, and so it raises the question, well, how is the U.S. going to coax the others to go along with a higher ambition level trade agreement? The other thing that I think sets the IPEF apart is the negotiations are being conducted on a modular approach. We've got 4 separate pillars: trade, supply chains, clean economy, and fair economy. And each one is being conducted as sort of a self-contained unit. Participants can opt into or opt out of any of these pillars that they like. And because they are fairly siloed, we don't see the horse trading across issues that we would see in a normal free trade agreement. The ability to horse trade across those issues often gets us to a higher level, a higher quality agreement. And the final thing I'll draw your attention to, which is an extremely important distinction between the IPEF and traditional free trade agreements, and this really raises a big red flag for me as a former trade negotiator, is it is entirely unclear what, if any, enforcement provisions the agreement is going to contain. So that opens the possibility you have a beautiful trade agreement with a lot of beautiful words on a piece of paper that you can't enforce. Okay? The second thing I would suggest you keep your eye on is that this is an agreement that is carrying very, very, very heavy geopolitical baggage, very, very heavy geopolitical overtones. Now, when Donald Trump, his first full day in the White House, when he was elected president, he pulled the United States out of the then TPP, which went on to become the CPTPP. Now, in the wake of that, certainly in perception and to a degree in reality, it seemed to signal that a decline in the relevance, the engagement, the importance of the United States in the Indo-Pacific region. And so IPEF is an opportunity for the Biden administration to make a very strong geopolitical statement. Hey, we're back. We're not disengaged. We're not irrelevant. We intend to drive or help drive the trade and economic agenda in the region. This is a message that the Biden administration probably wants to deliver to China as much, if not more, than any of the partners. Now, it's no secret that for most countries in this region, their best interests are served by what? By striking a balance between the US and China, by not tilting too definitively towards one country or the other, and not seeing one country gain too much preeminence at the expense of the other. A balance suits the national interests of most of the IPEF partners. Now, in recent years, and in particular after the United States leaving the TPP and then CPTPP, the sense is that China has perhaps grown a little bit too preeminent. And so a lot of these IPEF members really welcome and really want to encourage the US playing a more prominent role in the region to counterbalance China and to establish more of that balance that suits their interests in the region. Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is it then raises the question, okay, so are the IPEF partners, are they really interested in the trade agenda the United States is trying to push, or do they just want to do something to try to drag the United States back into the region? I can tell you at least two countries, Japan and Malaysia, their primary interest in the IPEF isn't the IPEF. Their primary interest in the IPEF is as a first step in trying to get the US back into the CPTPP. Now, if that's the case, it raises the question, okay, are we really going to see a significant agreement emerge out of these negotiations? We'll have to see. And the third thing, and this could turn out to be the most important thing, is that once we get through these negotiations, assuming we get through these negotiations, keep in mind the agreement will still face murky prospects in Washington, D.C. That is because the Biden administration has said, look, this is not a traditional free trade agreement. No tariff reductions. Therefore, we do not have to submit it to Congress for approval. We are going to implement this through executive orders in the United States. Now, there's a little potential storm cloud on the horizon, and it's called the presidential election. Because if anyone other than Joe Biden is elected president of the United States, the new incoming president certainly could, and I think probably would, sign an executive order on his or her first day in office, pulling the United States out of the IPEF agreement. I mean, my goodness, could you imagine if Donald Trump is elected president? Would it take him 15 minutes? You know, we can have an office poll to see how long we think it would take Trump to pull the United States out of IPEF. So really, the future will hinge to a large degree on the upcoming presidential election. In any case, keep a close eye on this. And I would say, certainly if it turns out and we end up with the optimistic scenario, and it is an innovative new template, that's an interesting story. But to be honest with you, it might actually be a more important and a more interesting story if this doesn't work. The implications of this not working could actually be more important than if it does. So in either case, please keep a close eye on this. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, this is an issue that I wanted to be sure to cover because I think it's still a little bit under the radar screen. And it's something I would really encourage you to keep your eye on and reflect on a little bit. We are in the midst of what is actually a fairly profound shift in our approach to international trade, and that is trade is no longer just about trade. Now, traditionally, trade patterns, trade relationships, trade agreements have been driven by the quest for greater economic efficiencies, lower prices for consumers, more access to a wider range of products for consumers. For businesses, optimized production patterns, greater profitability. And so this quest for greater efficiencies, of course, was reflected in our trade agreements. Our trade agreements were about tariff and non-tariff barriers, about services trade, investment, customs regulation, trade facilitation. But things are starting to change now. Trade is no longer just about trade. Trade is now being seen increasingly as a tool to advance a whole host of NTOs. Okay, I just geeked out on you. I just sprung some trade geek jargon on you. NTOs. NTOs means non-trade objectives. No reasonable person in the world has any reason to know that. NTOs, non-trade objectives. Okay, so we are now using trade and trade agreements to advance a whole bunch of stuff that has nothing to do with trade. And oftentimes, these NTOs are intertwined with culture-specific values or highly subjective values. So think about the issues that are now entering into trade discussions and trade agreements. We're now talking about human rights, labor rights, climate change. What's the right approach to address climate change? Freedom of religion, governance practices, indigenous rights, diversity and inclusion. Now, when I started my career as a trade negotiator in the 1980s, in a million years, no one would have ever believed that this is the stuff that trade agreements and trade discussions and trade negotiations have to deal with, but now they are on the agenda. And we saw a great example of this very recently. The United States Congress put a significant amount of pressure on the United States Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, to break off her trade discussions with Kenya. So what was the problem? Was Kenya guilty of an unfair trade practice? Did it violate a WTO rule? No. She was urged to break off trade discussions with Kenya because Kenya is considering a piece of anti-LGBTQ legislation. And they said, we can't facilitate trade with a country like this. Now Tai eventually went ahead with the trip, kept the dialogue open, but she has been very, 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 very straightforward in all of her public remarks, talking about how US trade policy is increasingly going to be driven and reflective of what she refers to as American values. And the European Union is by and large shoulder to shoulder with the United States, and particularly focused on labor rights and environment and climate change. So take a minute and you've really got to absorb where we are. We're seeing now a very broad scope of values-related considerations entering into the trade dialogue, and a willingness to restrict trade with countries that don't reflect your values, and to give preferential treatment to countries that do reflect your values. Now, set aside for a minute the relative merits or the values or the importance of any of these issues, and just think about this narrowly through the trade lens, and think about the complications, the questions, and the challenges that this raises when we introduce these value considerations into trade agreements. I mean, first and foremost, so-called universal values really aren't universal, okay? Sometimes it's hard for the United States and the European Union to learn this, but universal values are not quite as universal as assumed. And so one person's values is oftentimes another person's economic interests. And we have wide differences of interpretation when it comes to these issues, okay? The US and China go through a really interesting annual process that I guess in some respects is almost a little bit amusing. But every year, the US State Department puts out a report on human rights practices and human rights violations. And the chapter on China is usually very, very, very critical. And the State Department criticizes China for, among other things, oppression of religious minorities, the Uyghurs, for example. Then almost like clockwork, China turns around and China issues its report on human rights practices in the United States. And guess what? You'll be shocked to hear that China concludes that one of the worst human rights abusers in the world is the United States. And they point to things like systemic racism in the United States, oppression of African Americans. Okay? Now, there's never going to be agreement on this stuff. There's never going to be one common perspective on this stuff. Another challenge, another question, another potential complication is the possibility that this really exacerbates the dividing line between developed and less developed countries, between the West and less developed countries. Because from the perspective of a lot of less developed countries, they don't believe any of this. They don't believe any of this. They say, don't talk to us about values. This has nothing about values. It is nothing other than disguised protectionism, pure and simple. This is the latest trick you guys have come up with to give you guys an excuse to keep our products out of your market. So are we going to end up with an exacerbated dividing line here? And then another question that I think deserves a lot of attention is, will any of this work? You know, what is the objective? Will bringing these value-laden considerations into trading relationships, will it cause values to converge? Will it work? Will we remain in the same place, or worse yet, will the values even diverge further? So there's a lot of interesting issues. This is, I think, intrepid journalists could dig in to a lot of these questions and challenges as this continues to intensify in the weeks, months, and years to come. I'm going to draw my comments to a close there. There is a whole bunch of stuff that we didn't get to talk about, but the floor is entirely open. Anything that I covered that you'd like to discuss a little bit more, I'm happy to, or anything else. So thanks very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you, Steve. And if you all can just raise your hand, we'll bring mics around for your questions.
The question is talking about restrictions and kind of sanctions against like Russia and China. Mm-hmm. I wonder, considering the huge market of these two countries, who will damage more, who will affect more, USA or Russia and China? And the disagreement is, I hope we could say trade no longer just about trade. But personally, I believe we should say trade should not be about trade. Because, for example, you made an example about Kenya, but why, like USA is not trade with Kenya because of LGTB, right? But with same reason, USA should not collaborate with Saudi Arabia or with Indonesia or with many countries. But there's double standards, and there is like about climate change. Should I say like about things that USA did against climate change? I think like it is greenwashing, but practically, if the world acts as USA, we couldn't have this meeting because we were already underwater. Mm-hmm. And this is my message.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, look, you could certainly get a job as a deputy to Catherine Tai, because she strongly feels that these value considerations should be front and center. But I think your point is absolutely 100% valid. And that is, there is an incredible amount of hypocrisy in the way the West applies these value considerations to their trading relationships. And if the West was being honest, this is what it would say to the world. Our values are very, very, very important to us unless we really need stuff that you've got. And if you've got stuff like oil that we really, really need, our values, we can be a little bit flexible. So I think you're right. I think there is a fair amount of hypocrisy and another complication in this whole process of intertwining trade with values. In terms of where we are with restrictions and so forth on China on Russia, I would not group China and Russia. I think the importance of the China's market exceeds the importance of Russia's market by an order of magnitude. I think this is really the $64,000 question. I think this round of restrictions that have been put in place are going to continue to drive us in the direction of fragmentation and a push for greater self-sufficiency. Now, in the United States and the West, that's called onshoring and friendshoring. And in China, it's more, this is the dual circulation strategy. And it is referred to as self-sufficiency. So I think there's more concern about relying on potentially unreliable foreign partners. And I think it does cause these countries to look either entirely within their own borders or to a narrow group of quote unquote friends. So I think it does feed into the fragmentation that we're already seeing. Thank you.
I was just like probably curious about your opinion on this, but to what extent that trade should no longer just about trade, because well, I personally have this interest about how sorry, I'm trying to find a sentence there. Dividing line between developed and less developed countries about protectionism, because like well, Indonesia is experiencing this this moment, especially about biofuels, protection from the European Union, and also about like coals. But to what extent this trade should work to promote certain values? Because by the end of the day, yeah, there is this gap between the developed and less developed countries. Probably when the developed countries were developing, they weren't experiencing this much restriction on their part, and that's why they can be at that level. But if if trade is used in this way, this will like limiting developing countries to actually develop. So I was like thinking about probably rivalry or something, but by the end of the day, like let's say coals or biofuels or whatever, when the war between Russia and Ukraine happened, by the end of the day, countries need fossil energies. So yeah, so basically I was just curious to what extent this trade no longer just about trade. To what extent we should actually pursue this?
Yeah. Well, look. First of all, I won't presume to tell you if this is good, bad, or sideways as far as an idea is concerned. I'll leave that for you all to draw your own conclusions. But I think you put your finger on a number of really important points, and I think you pointed to one country that provides a really interesting case study for how this is going to play out, and that's Indonesia. Because Indonesia is a very large developing country, a very large resource-rich developing country. And the way that it extracts a lot of those resources really raises concerns, certainly in Brussels and to an extent in Washington, D.C. as well. And so this is already a point of friction between Indonesia and the developed world. And I think it's only going to become exacerbated. And I think it's also, look, we understand what the historical record here is. We understand that, and I guess this comes under the file heading that life is never fair. But what we have to recognize is we got into this mess because, the developed countries were industrializing in a way that was environmentally irresponsible, and have now contributed significantly to the climate change problem that we have. We recognize that it's a problem, and now the developing countries are telling the less developed countries, so now you have to potentially curtail your development in order to develop in a more environmentally responsible way. If Joko Widodo, president of Indonesia, complains about that, I commiserate with him. I feel for him. It's a factually correct point, but it's still an issue that has to be dealt with, and it's an issue that we've got to come to terms with between the developed and the less developed country. I don't know how they're going to sort it out, but these issues won't disappear. But I think at least potentially at the end of the day, it could greatly exacerbate the already existing dividing line. And I think Indonesia is a great example of that.
To my perception, it's true that trade is no more confined in trade. It's becoming more political, geopolitical, to exercise power or influence. It's assumed that Indo-Pacific Initiative has been introduced in contrast of Chinese Belt and Road Initiative to influence especially the least developed countries, because any trade agreement have some values to promote investment, employment, something like that. What your understanding, it's getting more political or not? Thank you.
Well, it's certainly getting more predictable, but the word of caution I provide is I don't know that IPEF and the BRI are directly comparable. So we've got IPEF being sort of a new style type of trade agreement, and the Belt and Road Initiative being about providing investment for infrastructure. Now, a lot of these same issues are still going to play out in the context of either. And it brings to light, there's a refrain that we hear a lot from so many different developing countries, that it's almost become a little bit of a cliche in terms of the different way the West and China pursues these types of issues. They say, from China, we get an airport. From Americans, we get lectures. So from the less developed countries, they're not really interested in hearing, well, here's how you need to treat your press, or here's how you need to treat your indigenous peoples or religion or whatever the case might be. They're kind of tired about hearing lectures, in particular, when China comes in and builds an airport. So I think there's a real sharp contrast there.
I'd like to ask about your perspective on what is happening in the Taiwan Strait, actually. And a lot of experts have been saying that, if there's a conflict between China and Taiwan, and US supporting Taiwan, that could trigger a much bigger conflict compared to what we are witnessing in Ukraine, because Taiwan Strait is very, very important for global trade, and US is investing a lot in the area. So, how do you see the overall developments in the Taiwan Strait after Nancy Pelosi's famous visit in September last year? And the second point is that a lot of Taiwanese companies are now diversifying their manufacturing bases from China to countries like Europe, Central Asia. They're investing in India as well. And all the democratic countries are talking about the need for trusted technology and denying critical technology to countries like China, you also mentioned. So how do you see the overall geopolitics playing out in the context of what we are seeing following emergence of AI and TSMC now, in fact, starting huge manufacturing facilities in US? Your overall perspective.
Sure. Well, look, on Taiwan, I can provide you a very direct but unsatisfying answer. I'm not a military analyst, and I wouldn't wade into that military or strategic issue as well. In terms of some of the technologies that you mentioned, we've reached a unique stage in development where it is safe to say that a handful of cutting-edge technologies, quantum computing, microelectronics, artificial intelligence, literally are going to hold the key to both economic preeminence and military preeminence in the decades to come. The handwriting is on the wall. We can see this. And so given that fact, that provides an additional rationale, an additional pretext, or if you prefer to say an additional excuse to put more and more restrictions on these technologies. So I think the fact that the technological development becoming intertwined with the geopolitical dynamics, I think this is here to stay, and I think it suggests to me that we're probably going to be heading towards more restrictions rather than less. And as I said, I do expect the U.S. to, if anything, not only maintain its restrictions, but probably increase them as well.
Hi, I want to ask over here.
Oh, sorry.
I just want to ask about IPEF a little bit.
Sure.
Let's assume that Biden stays in good health. He retains the presidency. He fends off the Republicans. There is the very real prospect of China over here ascending to the CPTPP, right? So, to what extent do you think the Biden administration can afford for the IPEF to purely be about the optics of engagement as opposed to real engagement and real substance going forward? Let's assume that the US doesn't want to play in the same playground as China. Well, they have to build something of their own, and it has to mean something. Can they just, let it continue the way, as you've said, the prospect of it being agreement of no real substance, or do you feel that they really have to make something of this IPEF in order to counterbalance the possible prospect of China maybe ascending the CPTPP or its other influences in the region?
Boy, I really wish you could pose that question at a cabinet meeting in the White House, because I would really, really, really love to hear the answers from the trade representative and the Secretary of Commerce. Look, you put your finger on some really important points there. They do need the IPEF to be about something rather than about nothing, but it is entirely unclear if they're going to succeed in that. Because we've got to recognize, and this is, whether you look at Democrats, whether you look at Republicans, whether you think of any of the most plausible candidates that could be elected in the near term to the presidency of the United States, nobody wants to go back to free trade agreements. And I have this argument all the time with my former colleagues in Washington, D.C., and they still believe, they have their analysis is that they do believe there could be a chance at some point in the future that the U.S. Would re-enter the TPP. I never say never. I don't rule it out, but I think it is exceedingly unlikely. Now, following the assumptions that you laid out, Biden stays in health and Biden gets reelected. Could we see sort of a different look at trade in the second term? It's possible. Could we see a reconsideration of CPTPP? It's possible. I just don't think it's likely. So I think the Biden administration's trade policy is now really between a rock and a hard place for those reasons.
I want to just add a issue, that is the Middle East issue. China last couple of years, they did a good diplomacy with the bringing China, Saudi Arabia and the Iran, and also the Qatar and United Arab Emirates. So this geopolitical issue is the more concern for the USA also, and as well as the China can more emphasis to the African region. So these two things I think you should consider in the relationship China and USA. Why China is going to the more focus on the Saudi Arabia, and USA is, I think, they are more threatening issues in the Middle East. They think that this is the next threat for the US trade and their friendship in the Middle East. That should be more focus in our discussion also.
Well, look, I'll add something to the comments that you've made. I would say, China has not only scored some diplomatic victories and some geopolitical victories in the Middle East, not only in Africa, but probably of equal concern to the United States, also in Latin America. China has made some important inroads in terms of building out its economic, its trade, its developmental relationship with countries in Latin America. And another thing to keep an eye on, there is a new incoming president in Latin America at the Inter-American Development Bank. The new incoming president has a much more positive outlook on China and a much more positive outlook towards working with China on developmental programs. So I think that China has made important strides in building its relationships around the world. I think if somebody representing the Biden administration here would talk to some US efforts as well. But I think at least in terms of the money being spent by the West on some of these developmental and aid programs, it pales in comparison to what China has spent. And it does not go unnoticed by the countries. I'll give you a personal opinion. Biden made a big deal of inviting the leaders of ASEAN to come for a summit at the White House. And he announced a package of aid, developmental assistance for ASEAN that was almost embarrassingly small. The exact dollar amount escapes my memory at the moment, but it was just almost a comically insignificant amount of money that the United States was committing, certainly in comparison to the money that China has committed in the region. So I think, again, at least in the Indo-Pacific, I think the IPEF is an attempt to try to get some of those relationships back on track, but it remains to be seen whether or not it will succeed.
Thank you so much.
Sure, my pleasure. Guys, please connect with me, stay in touch. Anything that you need help with, if I can't help you, I'll try to point you in the direction. So please take me up on that. Thank you.